I'm Jerry, 32 male. I live alone in a small but comfortable apartment in the city, working as an IT specialist for a mid-sized firm. My life has always been quiet, a stark contrast to the one I was born into, a life I was largely excluded from. It's a story about family, wealth, and the cold realization that sometimes the people who should love you the most are the ones who will throw you away without a second thought. But it's also a story about how my late father, a man I thought barely knew me, left me the one tool I needed to reclaim not just my dignity, but his true legacy. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. My relationship with my family was, to put it mildly, complicated. My father, Richard, was a brilliant software engineer who built a tech empire from the ground up. He was a quiet, intense man, always lost in thought or code. My mother, Eleanor, was his opposite. She was a socialite, a woman who valued appearances, connections, and the pristine image of our family above all else. I was the unfortunate smudge on that pristine image. I inherited my father's quiet nature and his aptitude for technology, but not his ambition or his knack for navigating the cutthroat world he operated in. Eleanor saw this as a weakness, a personal failing. She wanted a son who would be a captain of industry, a charismatic leader. Instead, she got me. A quiet, unassuming IT guy who preferred the clean logic of a server room to the messy politics of a boardroom. Things became infinitely worse when Eleanor's daughter from her first marriage, Chloe, came to live with us permanently after her own father passed away. Chloe was everything I was. She was bubbly, beautiful, and effortlessly charming. She knew how to play the game, how to tell Eleanor exactly what she wanted to hear. At 28, she was a self-proclaimed influencer and ran a small online boutique that was, by all accounts, funded entirely by my father's generosity. She became the daughter Eleanor always wanted, and I was relegated to the role of the awkward, disappointing son. My father was always caught in the middle. He was a man who communicated better through lines of code than through conversation. He provided for me, paid for my education, and made sure I was never in need, but emotional connection was not in his programming. We'd have stilted dinners where Eleanor and Chloe would dominate the conversation with talk of galas and social events, while my dad and I would sit in relative silence. Occasionally, he'd ask me about a new piece of hardware or a programming language, and for a few brief moments, we'd connect on a level no one else at the table could understand. Those moments were rare treasures. As my father's health began to decline, the distance between me and the rest of the family grew into a chasm. Eleanor took complete control of his care, his schedule, and who was allowed to see him. My calls were often screened, my visits postponed. "He's resting, Jerry," she'd say in a tone that brooked no argument. "The doctor says he needs to be in a calm environment." The implication was clear: I was not part of that calm environment. Chloe would echo her mother's sentiments, often texting me things like, "Mom's really stressed. Maybe give it a few days before you try to visit again. We've got it covered." They were systematically cutting me out, and my father, weakened by his illness, was powerless to stop it. The last time I saw him alive was through a hospital room door. Eleanor stood in the way, a sentinel in pearls and a cashmere sweater. "He's just fallen asleep," she'd whispered, her voice laced with false sympathy. "It's for the best." I looked past her and saw my father, frail and small, in the hospital bed, and I knew deep down it was my last chance. I should have pushed past her, I should have made a scene, but I didn't. I just nodded, turned around, and walked away. That inaction would haunt me for weeks. Then came the news of his passing. It was Chloe who called, her voice a practiced performance of grief. "Jerry, Daddy's gone," she said, as if she had any right to call him that. The funeral was arranged with terrifying efficiency. It was less a memorial and more a high society event, a chance for Eleanor to play the part of the stoic, grieving widow for her influential friends. I knew my presence was not desired, but he was my father. I had to be there. I chose a simple, dark suit, a stark contrast to the designer mourning where that would surely be on display. I didn't want to stand out. I just wanted to pay my respects and say the goodbye I'd been denied. When I arrived at the grand, cathedral-like funeral home, the air was thick with the scent of lilies and expensive perfume. I saw Eleanor near the entrance, greeting guests with a sad, dignified smile. She was flanked by Chloe, both of them dressed in immaculate black. When Eleanor's eyes landed on me, her smile faltered for a fraction of a second. It was a micro-expression of pure annoyance. Before she could say anything, an old family friend approached her, and I used the opportunity to slip inside, finding a seat in the back row, hoping to remain invisible. The service began, filled with hollow eulogies from people who knew Richard Sterling, the CEO, but not Richard Sterling, my father. They spoke of his business acumen, his ruthless negotiating skills, and his contributions to various charities, donations I knew Eleanor had orchestrated for the social capital. No one spoke of his quiet kindness, his love for old sci-fi movies, or the way his eyes would light up when he solved a particularly complex coding problem. It was a funeral for a stranger. As the service concluded and people began to file out, I wanted one last moment. I approached the casket, my heart pounding in my chest. I just needed to say goodbye, to tell him I was sorry for not fighting harder to see him. I was only a few feet away when a firm hand landed on my shoulder. I turned to see two large men in dark suits, security guards hired for the event. Behind them, walking towards me with a look of cold fury, was my mother. Elinor glided towards me, her face a mask of controlled sorrow that did not quite reach her eyes. Chloe trailed behind her, a concerned look plastered on her face that was so fake it was almost comical. The guests who hadn't yet departed began to slow their exit, their curiosity piqued by the unfolding drama. This was exactly what I had wanted to avoid. Jerry, Elinor began, her voice a low, theatrical whisper that carried perfectly in the hushed hall. What do you think you're doing? I'm saying goodbye to my father, I said, my own voice barely audible. My throat felt tight, and the grief I had been holding back was threatening to spill over. You're causing a scene, she hissed, her eyes darting around to see who was watching. People are staring. You're making a spectacle of yourself at your own father's funeral. I was standing perfectly still. I hadn't spoken to anyone. I hadn't made a sound. The only scene being created was the one she was orchestrating right now. I'm not doing anything, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I just want a moment. You had your moments, she lied, her voice rising slightly. You barely visited him in the hospital, you showed no interest. Now you choose today in front of all these people to put on this show of the grieving son? I won't have it. It's disrespectful to his memory. The accusation was so outrageously false that it stole the air from my lungs. She was the one who had blocked my visits, who had screened my calls. Chloe, seeing her cue, stepped forward and placed a gentle hand on my arm. Jerry, please, she cooed, her voice dripping with condescension. Mom is just emotional right now. Maybe it's best if you just go, for her sake. The combined force of their gaslighting was staggering. They were painting me as a disruptive, attention-seeking intruder at my own father's service. The two security guards shifted their weight, their presence a silent, looming threat. I looked from my mother's cold, unforgiving face to my stepsister's saccharine, manipulative one. I saw no path forward. Arguing would only prove their point, making me the hysterical son causing a scene. Remaining silent was an admission of guilt. Please, I said, my voice cracking, just let me say goodbye. That was my mistake. The crack in my voice, the plea for basic human decency, was the weakness Elinor needed. He's had enough of your drama, she said, her voice turning to steel. She gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod to the security guards. Please escort my son out. He's clearly overwrought and needs some fresh air. The guards moved in. One stood on either side of me. They didn't grab me aggressively, but their presence was an iron wall. One of them spoke, his voice low and professional. Sir, if you'll come with us, it wasn't a request. Utterly defeated, I felt a hot wave of shame wash over me. I looked past them to the casket, a polished mahogany box holding the man who was half of my DNA, now completely out of reach. I saw the faces of the remaining guests, their expressions a mixture of pity, confusion, and morbid curiosity. They were Elinor's friends, her allies. In their eyes, I was whatever she told them I was. I didn't resist. I allowed the two men to turn me around and walk me towards the large oak doors of the funeral home. Every step was a fresh humiliation. I could feel Elinor's triumphant gaze on my back. She had won. She had successfully curated her husband's final public appearance, and that curation included a final decisive excision of me. As I was walked through the doors and out into the cold, gray afternoon, I glanced back one last time. I saw C. H-Lo wrapping a comforting arm around Elinor, who was dabbing at a dry eye with a silk handkerchief, playing the role of the victim to perfection. The doors clicked shut behind me, the sound echoing the finality of my exile. I stood on the steps of the funeral home, the sounds of the city traffic seeming unnaturally loud. I was an outcast, formally and publicly disowned at the lowest point of my life. The shame was so intense it felt like a physical illness. I stumbled down the steps and just started walking, with no destination in mind, wanting only to put as much distance as possible between myself and that place. The cold air stung my cheeks, which were now wet with tears I hadn't even realized I was shedding. Humiliation, grief, and a profound sense of injustice churned in my stomach. They had taken everything. They had taken my father from me in his final months, and now they had taken my right to even mourn him. I felt utterly powerless, a pawn in a game I didn't even know I was playing. And for a few desperate hours as I walked aimlessly through the city streets, I believed that was the end of the story. I was the unwanted son, cast out and forgotten. I had lost. I walked for hours until the city lights began to blur through my tear-filled eyes and my legs ached with exhaustion. I ended up back at my apartment, the one place that felt like mine, a sanctuary from Elinor and Chloe's world. The silence inside was deafening. I tossed my keys on the counter and collapsed onto the sofa, the dark suit feeling like a costume from a play I had been violently thrown out of. The humiliation from the funeral replayed in my mind on a loop. My mother's icy words, the pitying stares of the guests, the firm hands of the security guards on my shoulders. It was a highlight reel of my own powerlessness. I felt hollowed out as if some essential part of me had been scooped out and discarded. I must have drifted into a restless, grief-stricken sleep right there on the couch, because the next thing I knew my phone was buzzing on the coffee table, the screen illuminating the dark room. I squinted at it, assuming it was a condolence text from one of the few friends who knew about my father. But it wasn't. It was a calendar notification from an obscure encrypted email service I hadn't used in years. The notification read, "Execute Protocol." My heart skipped a beat. Execute Protocol was a phrase my father and I had created when I was a teenager. It was our little inside joke, a term we used for a failsafe plan. I had been helping him set up a complex, multi-layered backup system for his personal research, and we designed a dead man's switch, a system that would automatically execute a command if he didn't log in and reset a timer within a specific period. This email was that switch. It was a message from the past, a digital ghost reaching out from beyond the grave. With trembling hands, I grabbed my laptop. I had to dig through old files to find the login credentials for the encrypted email service. It took me nearly 20 minutes, my mind racing with 100 different possibilities. What could he have wanted to send me that was so important it had to be delivered posthumously? Finally, I was in. There was a single unread email. The sender was an anonymized address, but I knew it was from him. The subject line was simple, "For Jerry's eyes only." My breath hitched as I clicked it open. The email was short, but its contents would change everything. It read, "Jerry, if you are reading this, it means I am gone and the automated system worked as designed. I apologize for the silence and the distance these past few years. Things became complicated. Alina's priorities shifted and I was not strong enough to fight her on every front. I fear she may not have your best interests at heart when it comes to my legacy. But my true legacy is not in the company's stock value or the properties we own. It is in the digital world I built, and that is what I am entrusting to you. I have left you something far more valuable than money. I have left you control." In the bottom drawer of my old desk in the home study, the one Alina never uses, you will find a small, leather-bound journal. Inside, you will find the master key and instructions for my entire digital estate. This includes my personal servers, my cloud storage, my cryptocurrency wallets, and the private repositories containing all my original source code and research notes. Everything. I have legally designated you as the sole digital executor of my estate in a letter filed with my lawyer, David Chen, but I am giving you the keys directly. Alina will receive the house, the stocks, the physical assets. She will believe she has inherited everything of value. She does not understand where the real value lies. You do. Be careful, son. I don't know what you will find, but I trust you to do the right thing with it. You have more of my strength in you than yo. You know. Love, Dad. I read the email 3 times, the words blurring and sharpening on the screen. A wave of emotions washed over me, grief, shock, and a spark of something I hadn't felt in a long time, hope. This wasn't just an inheritance, it was a mission. It was a final message of trust and faith from a man I thought had forgotten me. He hadn't been a passive victim in Alina's game, he had been planning, creating a final move on the chessboard that only I could make. The letter was a vindication. It confirmed my suspicions about Alina and validated the feeling of being pushed out. More than that, it was a profound apology and a declaration of love, communicated in the only way my father knew how, through a secure encrypted system. The home study he mentioned was in the sprawling mansion I grew up in, a place I hadn't set foot in for over a year. Getting inside would be the first challenge. Alina and Chloe would be there, wallowing in their victory. I couldn't just walk in the front door. But my father, ever the planner, had likely thought of that. The old desk, the leather-bound journal, the keys to his kingdom. Suddenly, the humiliation of the funeral began to recede, replaced by a cold, sharp sense of purpose. Alina thought she had won. She thought she had ejected the unwanted son and secured her future. She was about to find out that the game wasn't over. My father had just handed me all the cheat codes. The first hurdle was getting into the house. I couldn't just ring the doorbell. Alina would slam the door in my face or worse, call the police and claim I was harassing her in her time of grief. I needed to be smarter. I needed to be invisible. I remembered the old security system my dad had installed years ago. He had taught me the administrator codes, proud of the backdoors and overrides he had programmed into it. It was a long shot, but I suspected Alina, who was famously tech-illiterate, would never have bothered to change them. I waited until 2 nights after the funeral. I parked my car a few blocks away and approached the house on foot, shrouded in the late-night darkness. The sprawling mansion was mostly dark, save for a single light on in the upstairs living area. I crept around to the side entrance, the one leading to the mudroom. My heart pounded as I keyed in the old admin override code on the keypad. For a tense second, nothing happened. Then a soft green light blinked, followed by the quiet thunk of the magnetic lock disengaging. I was in. The house was eerily silent, a museum of a life I was once a part of. Family photos lined the walls, most of them featuring a smiling Alina and Chloe, with my father looking slightly awkward and out of place. There were very few photos of me. I navigated the familiar hallways like a ghost, my soft-soled shoes making no sound on the marble floors. The home study was at the far end of the house, a sanctuary of wood paneling and leather-bound books that my father had treated as his fortress of solitude. As he'd predicted in his email, the room looked untouched, a layer of dust gathering on the surfaces. Alina and Chloe had no interest in a room filled with old books and computer manuals. My father's desk was a massive mahogany affair. My hands trembled slightly as I pulled open the bottom drawer. It was filled with old schematics and bundles of cables, but tucked in the very back, just as he said it would be, was a small dark brown leather journal. I felt a jolt, a tangible connection to my father across the void of death. I quickly slipped the journal into my jacket pocket and made my way out of the house as silently as I had entered. Back in the safety of my own apartment, I opened the journal. The first page contained a handwritten note in my father's familiar, blocky script. Jerry, the key is not a word but a sequence. The clues are in the memories only you would have. Below the note was a long, complex string of encrypted text, the master key. The rest of the journal was filled with what looked like gibberish, dates, server IP addresses, lines of code, and cryptic phrases. It was a roadmap, but one written in a language only I could understand. The first clue was a date, 7/14/2005. It took me a moment, but then it hit me. It was the date we went to see the launch of the Mars rover on a big screen at the Science Museum. I was 12. He'd taken the day off work, something he rarely did. Under the date was a phrase, the Little Commander. That was his nickname for me that day. I had a toy astronaut and I kept calling it the Mission Commander. The password for the first server was Little Commander 2005. It worked. I had access to his primary personal server. It was like stepping into my father's mind. The server was meticulously organized. There were folders containing decades of research, project prototypes, and personal logs. But as I started digging, I found another layer, a partitioned and heavily encrypted section. Labeled Contingency. Unlocking this section required another key, and the clue in the journal was an IP address paired with the word Prometheus. Prometheus was the name of the first custom computer my dad and I built together when I was in high school. The password was the serial number of the motherboard we used, a number I had memorized because I was so proud of our creation. I typed it in and the partition unlocked. What I found inside made my blood run cold. It was my father's private digital diary, a collection of encrypted audio files and documents detailing the last few years of his life. He had been documenting everything. There were recordings of his conversations with Alina. I listened, my stomach churning, as I heard my mother pressuring him to change his will to sign over assets to her and Chloe to cut me out. Jerry has his own life, Richard, her voice dripped with poison. He doesn't need this. Chloe and I are the ones who are here for you. I heard my father's weak, tired voice trying to argue, trying to stand up for me, only to be worn down by her relentless campaign. But there was more. My father had suspected Alina and Chloe were mismanaging his finances. He had set up a keylogger on the main family computer, the one Alina used for online banking and Chloe used for her boutique. The logs were horrifying. They were draining his accounts, making extravagant purchases, and funneling money from his personal accounts into Chloe's failing business under the guise of household expenses. There were invoices for $1,000 handbags, luxury spa weekends, and even a down payment on a new sports car for Chloe, all logged while my father was in the hospital. They weren't just neglecting him, they were actively robbing him blind while he lay dying. The most damning discovery was in a folder labeled The Foundation. My father had been secretly planning to use the majority of his personal fortune, the part not tied up in the public company, to launch a charitable foundation for underprivileged students in STEM fields. It was his passion project, his real legacy. He had audio notes detailing his plans, his vision, and his designated board members. The first name on the list was Arthur Vance, his old business partner and closest friend. The second name was mine. Alina knew about the foundation. In one of the audio logs, she ridiculed the idea. Charity, she scoffed. Richard, your charity begins at home, don't be a fool. She thought that by securing the will, she had killed the project and secured the money for herself. She had no idea that the plans, the funds, and the legal framework were all documented in this digital fortress, a fortress to which I now held the key. The pieces were all there. The evidence of their greed, their deceit, and their theft. My father hadn't just left me control, he had left me a weapon of truth. Armed with the devastating truth from my father's digital archive, my grief began to crystallize into a cold, hard resolve. This was no longer just about the humiliation I suffered at the funeral. This was about honoring my father's true wishes and exposing Alina and Chloe for who they really were. They hadn't just betrayed me, they had betrayed him in the most profound way possible. My plan started to form, not as a messy, emotional outburst, but as a systematic, logical sequence of actions, much like a program I was writing. My father had given me the source code to their downfall, and I was going to execute it flawlessly. My first step was to contact Arthur Vance. His name was all over my father's notes about the foundation. He was listed not just as a future board member, but as a trusted confidant. I found his number and called him, introducing myself as Richard's son. His voice was warm but cautious. He offered his condolences and spoke highly of my father. I told him I had something of my father's that I needed to show him, something important that couldn't be discussed over the phone. We agreed to meet the next day at his office. Arthur Vance was a kind-eyed man in his late 60s with a sharp mind that was immediately apparent. He looked at me with a mixture of sympathy and curiosity. "Your father was a good man, Jerry," he said, pouring me a coffee. "A brilliant one. I was sorry to see how things ended up." He was being diplomatic, but I could tell he knew more than he was letting on. I didn't waste time. I opened my laptop and played him one of the audio files. A recording where my father excitedly detailed his vision for the STEM Foundation to Arthur, followed by a later, secret recording of Alina dismissing the idea as sentimental nonsense. Arthur's expression hardened as he listened. "I knew it," he said, shaking his head. "Richard told me he was having trouble with Alina over this. He said she couldn't see past the next charity gala. He was so passionate about giving back." I then showed him the financial logs, the evidence. See of Alina and Chloe's spending spree while my father was in the hospital. Arthur's face grew grim. This is theft," he murmured, scrolling through the spreadsheets I had compiled. They were bleeding him dry. By the time I finished, Arthur was fully on my side. He was a powerful ally, not just a friend of my father's, but a respected figure in the business community with legal and financial resources I could only dream of. "Your father was a genius, Jerry," Arthur said, a newfound respect in his eyes. "He built a digital vault and gave the key to the one person he knew he could trust. So what's your plan?" My plan was to become the ghost in their machine. Alina and Chloe believed they had inherited a financial empire. They saw numbers in bank accounts and stock portfolios. They had no idea that the real control, the digital infrastructure that managed all of it, was now in my hands. My father's digital estate included the admin access to the family's smart home system, their cloud accounts, and most importantly, the private servers that handled their personal finances and communications. The first phase was subtle. I started by rerouting their personal emails through a filter on a private server. Any email related to finances, legal matters, or investments was duplicated and sent to a secure inbox I controlled. They wouldn't notice a thing, but I would see everything. I would have a real-time record of their actions and intentions. Next, I targeted their comfort and convenience, using my access to the smart home. Nothing major, just small, inexplicable glitches designed to slowly fray their nerves. The heating would mysteriously switch off in Chloe's wing of the house on cold nights. The sophisticated sound system would randomly start playing my father's favorite classical music, pieces Alina had always hated, at odd hours. The security lights would flicker on and off for no reason. Chloe complained on her social media about the house being super creepy lately, which brought a grim smile to my face. These were just psychological games, a way to disrupt the smug comfort of their victory. The real strike was aimed at their finances. Arthur and I worked with a forensic accountant he trusted. Using the evidence from my father's keylogger and the new emails I was intercepting, we began meticulously documenting every fraudulent transaction, every stolen dollar. We created a perfect, undeniable timeline of their greed. The final piece of the plan was the foundation. While Alina and Chloe were busy planning how to spend their inheritance, Arthur and I were quietly working in the background to bring my father's dream to life. We used my father's detailed notes to finalize the charter and contacted the other individuals he had wanted on the board. We registered the Richard Sterling STEM Foundation as a legal entity. The masterstroke was discovering the bulk of my father's personal fortune wasn't in a standard bank account. It was in a series of cryptocurrency wallets, the keys to which were in the leather journal. It was a massive sum of money completely off Aliner's radar. She didn't even know it existed. I began the process of carefully liquidating a portion of it, transferring the funds into the newly created foundation's accounts. My father's real legacy was being built, while Alina and Chloe were living in a gilded cage, completely unaware that the walls were about to come crashing down. I was ready for the confrontation, but it wouldn't be a shouting match. It would be a quiet, formal meeting where the truth, backed by undeniable digital evidence, would be laid bare. They had humiliated me in public. I would dismantle their world in private with the cold, irrefutable logic of a computer program. The stage for the final act was set for the formal reading of the will. It was in many ways a formality, as Alina was convinced she already knew the outcome. She had successfully pressured my father into signing a new will months before his death, a document that named her as the primary heir to his estate and Chloe as a significant beneficiary. I was left a token amount, a sum so small it was a calculated insult. Alina had scheduled the meeting at the office of her own lawyer, a slick corporate attorney named Mr. Hayes. She wanted an audience, a final official confirmation of her total victory. What she didn't know was that I had already spoken to my father's actual lawyer, Mr. Chen, who had been sidelined by Alina but was legally obligated to be present. I had also invited Arthur Vance. I walked into the polished boardroom and the atmosphere immediately turned frosty. Alina and Chloe were seated on one side of the massive oak table, looking like queens holding court. They were dressed in expensive, somber chic attire, the picture of wealthy widows. When they saw me, followed by Arthur Vance, their expressions soured. "Jerry," Alina said, her voice dripping with condescent. "Encion, I'm surprised to see you. I thought we'd just mail you your portion." Chloe shot me a smirk, a silent echo of her mother's contempt. "And Arthur," Alina continued, turning her disdain on my father's oldest friend, "I wasn't aware you were a party to these proceedings." "I'm here as a friend of Richard's," Arthur said calmly, taking a seat opposite them, "and as an interested party in the execution of his true legacy." I sat beside him, placing my laptop on the table. I said nothing, letting the silence unnerve them. Mr. Hayes, Alina's lawyer, cleared his throat and began the proceedings. He read through the will, his voice droning on. As predicted, the bulk of the physical assets, the house, the art collection, the stock portfolio from my father's company, went to Alina. Chloe received a substantial trust fund, and then came my name. And to my son, Jerry Sterling, I leave the sum of $25,000. Chloe couldn't suppress a small, triumphant smile. This was it, the final nail in the coffin of my significance to the family. When Mr. Hayes finished, he looked up. "Are there any questions?" "Actually, yes," I said, speaking for the first time. I opened my laptop. "There seems to be a significant portion of my father's estate that isn't mentioned in this document," Alina scoffed. "Don't be ridiculous, Jerry. Everything is accounted for. Don't try to make this difficult." "I'm not talking about the physical estate," I said, my voice calm and even. "I'm talking about the digital estate." I looked at Mr. Chen, my father's lawyer. "Mr. Chen, could you please present the codicil regarding the appointment of the digital executor?" Mr. Chen, who had been waiting for his cue, opened his briefcase and produced a notarized letter. He read it aloud. It was a document my father had signed and filed a year ago, legally appointing me, Jerry Sterling, as the sole executor of his entire digital estate. This included all personal data, intellectual property, digital accounts, and assets. Alina's face went from smug to confused. "Digital estate? What is that? Some computer files. It's meaningless." "On the contrary," I said, turning my laptop screen towards them, "it's far from meaningless." The first thing I brought up was a live feed of their personal bank accounts. I showed them the current balances. Then I brought up the meticulous records of their spending over the past year, the spreadsheets, the receipts, the dates. "This is a record of over $900,000 that you, Alina, and you, Chloe, transferred from my father's personal accounts into your own while he was in the hospital. Funds that were then spent on luxury goods, vacations, and propping up Chloe's failing business." Chloe went pale. Alina's eyes widened in fury. "How did you get that? That's private." "Your definition of private is interesting," I replied coolly. "My father, the account owner, was documenting it all. He gave me the key. Next, I moved on to the intellectual property. My father's most valuable work wasn't the public company. It was his private research, his algorithms, and his original source code, all held on private servers. According to this codicil, that all belongs to me. A conservative estimate values this IP at over $30 million. Alina was speechless, her jaw working silently. This was a language she didn't understand, a part of Richard's world she had always dismissed and ignored. The final blow came when Arthur Vance spoke up. "Alina," he said, his voice laced with disappointment. "Richard's greatest wish was to establish a foundation for young people in science and technology. He intended to fund it with his personal fortune, a fortune you were unaware of." I brought up the details of the Richard Sterling STEM Foundation on the screen. I showed them the legally filed paperwork and the current bank balance, a little over $50 million transferred from my father's cryptocurrency wallets. My father's real legacy, I said, looking directly at my mother. The inheritance he truly cared about, and he entrusted it to me and Arthur to execute. The room was silent. The color had drained from Alina and Chloe's faces. They had won the house, the stocks, the cash they could see, but I had inherited my father's mind, his work, his real fortune, and his legacy. The slick lawyer, Mr. Hayes, looked completely bewildered. This is highly irregular. It is perfectly legal, Mr. Chen stated firmly. The documents are all in order. I closed my laptop. Alina, you can have the house full of memories you twisted and the money you stole, I said, my voice devoid of emotion. But my father's name, his life's work, and his future, that's mine now, and one more thing. I slid a thick folder across the table. That contains the full evidence of the financial fraud you committed. Arthur and I are prepared to turn this over to the authorities. However, we are willing to refrain on one condition. You will not contest any of this, and you will publicly endorse the foundation. You will play the part of the proud widow supporting her late husband's charitable dream. The image you care so much about will remain intact, but we will know the truth. Alina stared at the folder as if it were a snake. She had been so thoroughly, so completely outmaneuvered. She had played a game of social standing and emotional manipulation, while my father and I had been playing a different game altogether, a game of logic, data, and legacy. And we had won. In the aftermath of that meeting, the silence from Alina and Chloe was absolute. There were no angry phone calls, no threats, no attempts to challenge the digital codicil. They were trapped. The evidence of their financial misconduct was a guillotine hanging over their heads, and they knew it. They had no choice but to accept the terms. A week later, a press release, carefully drafted by Arthur's PR team, announced the launch of the Richard Sterling STEM Foundation. It included a quote from Alina, the grieving widow, expressing her profound pride in carrying on her late husband's philanthropic vision. It was a masterpiece of corporate spin, and it made my stomach turn, but it was a necessary evil. Her public endorsement cemented the foundation's legitimacy and permanently cut off any path for her to challenge it later. She got to keep her pristine public image, but it was a hollow prize. She was the queen of an empty castle. She had the mansion, but its smart systems were no longer under her control. I had quietly transferred ownership to the foundation's holding company. She had the money from the will, but it was a pittance compared to the fortune she now knew existed, a fortune she could never touch. Chloe's social media presence changed overnight. The lavish posts about shopping sprees and exotic trips vanished. Her online boutique quietly went out of business a few months later. Without the constant infusion of my father's money, her extravagant lifestyle was unsustainable. The last I heard, she was working a retail job, a reality check that was long overdue. I never saw or spoke to either of them again. I had no desire for further confrontation or revenge. Exposing them was not about punishment, it was about correction. It was about resetting the balance and ensuring my father's true legacy wasn't buried under their greed. My life, on the other hand, was transformed. I resigned from my IT job and dedicated myself full-time to the foundation. Working alongside Arthur Vance, I dove headfirst into bringing my father's vision to life. We established scholarship programs for underprivileged students, funded coding boot camps in low-income neighborhoods, and created a mentorship program that paired young, aspiring engineers with veterans in the tech industry. It was more fulfilling than any work I had ever done. Every time we received a letter from a scholarship recipient, every time I saw the look of excitement on a young student's face as they wrote their first line of code, I felt a connection to my father that I had craved my entire life. I was finally understanding him, not through stilted dinner conversations, but through his work, his passion, and his quiet desire to make the world a slightly better place. I was living his legacy. I sold the mansion. It held too many cold memories. The proceeds were funneled directly into the foundation's endowment. I kept only a few things from the house, my father's old books from the study, the Prometheus computer we built together, and a single framed photo of the two of us at the Science Museum, the day he called me his little commander. The digital estate my father left me was more than just a tool for revenge. It was his final, most eloquent message to me. Through his meticulous planning and digital foresight, he had told me he saw me, he trusted me, and he loved me in the best way he knew how. He had given me a purpose that rose from the ashes of my public humiliation. I was no longer the unwanted son, the awkward IT guy lurking in the shadows of a glamorous family. I was Jerry Sterling, the steward of my father's dream, the head of his foundation. I had found my own worth not by fighting for a seat at their table, but by building a new one, a table where everyone with a passion for knowledge and innovation was welcome. The pain of my past with Alina and Chloe didn't disappear entirely, but it no longer defined me. It became a quiet, distant echo, a reminder of the life I had left behind. My new foundation was not built on the crumbling ruins of revenge, but on the solid bedrock of purpose, a purpose gifted to me by a father who had, in the end, truly seen his son.